It was a Tuesday morning in late September, the kind of day in Milford where the air already hinted at the shift toward autumn. Parents moved through their routines with the quiet efficiency of habit, carrying diaper bags, lunch boxes, and small, half-asleep children toward the low brick building of Bright Steps Daycare. The parking lot was nearly full by 8 o'clock, engines idling as goodbyes were exchanged and hurried conversations with teachers took place under the overcast sky. Inside, the faint hum of chatter and the clatter of toys on tile floors mixed with the smell of instant coffee drifting from the staff lounge. Among the children arriving that morning was 2-year-old Clara Bell. Her mother carried her across the lot, the hood of a bright yellow raincoat pulled snug over her head, the fabric beaded with the mist that had been falling since before dawn. In Clara's small hand was a well-worn plush rabbit, its ears chewed soft from years of comfort, its fur matted in places from washing. The daycare staff recorded her arrival at precisely 8:17 a.m., as they did with every child, the time written in neat blue ink beside her name on the clipboard just inside the front door. Clara's mother crouched to unfasten her raincoat, smoothed her daughter's hair, and said something quiet that made the little girl clutch the rabbit tighter before toddling toward the play area. The morning unfolded in the predictable rhythm familiar to the staff. Some children settled into art tables, smearing paint onto construction paper, while others gathered on a rug with picture books. Outside, the drizzle came and went in brief spells, never enough to fully soak the ground, but leaving the air damp and cool. Teachers kept the children indoors until mid-morning, waiting for a break in the weather. Shortly after 10:30, the decision was made to let them outside for a short recess before snack time. The yard was enclosed on all sides by a chain-link fence with climbing structures, a small swing set, and at its farthest edge, a wooden playhouse painted pale blue. A line of hedges grew along the fence behind it, thick enough to block the view of the service road beyond. Teachers positioned themselves at intervals along the perimeter, watching as the children scattered into their favorite corners of the yard. Clara drifted toward the playhouse, the rabbit still in her hand, stepping carefully over a puddle near the slide. At 10:41 a.m., one of the staff members noticed her standing just outside the playhouse door, looking inside. A moment later, she stepped forward and disappeared from view. It was an unremarkable moment at first. Children often went in and out of the playhouse during recess, and the staff member turned to guide another child away from the swings. When she looked back less than a minute later, Clara was gone. A quick glance around the yard didn't raise immediate alarm. The assumption was that she'd wandered to another play area or back toward the building, but a sweep of the yard turned up nothing. No one had seen her walk toward the door. None of the other children remembered her passing. The teachers called her name, first casually, then more urgently. The sound of it cut across the yard, sharper each time, but no small figure in a yellow raincoat emerged. Within minutes, the search expanded to the building. Staff moved room to room, checking bathrooms, closets, and storage spaces, calling out her name. By now, the easy chatter of playtime had shifted to tense whispers among adults. The head teacher ordered the gates locked and told the office to call 911. The front door was secured. Parents who had arrived for early pickups told to remain inside until authorities arrived. The first responding officer was on scene in under 10 minutes, quickly followed by more patrol units. The yard was cleared of all children, and the staff gathered for statements. Officers walked the perimeter, testing the gate latches, scanning the hedges, and peering into the narrow spaces between the fence and overgrown shrubbery. Just outside the playhouse door, lying on the wet grass, was Clara's rabbit. It was on its side, one ear bent, the fabric darkened by moisture. No footprints were visible nearby, the soft ground muddied only by dozens of small sneaker prints from recess. By now, the daycare was under full lockdown. Officers began knocking on doors of the houses opposite the playground, asking if anyone had noticed a child in a yellow coat or an unfamiliar vehicle. In the parking lot, parents clutched their children close, some crying openly as they were escorted back inside. Clara's mother, who had been called at work, arrived pale and shaking, pushing past the officers to see the spot where her daughter had last been seen. She froze when she saw the rabbit in an evidence bag, her voice breaking as she confirmed it was Clara's. As the minutes stretched into an hour, the urgency deepened. Patrol cars lined the street. Officers fanned out in both directions along the service road behind the hedge. Every space in and around the daycare was searched again, this time methodically, by police and staff moving together. But there was no sign of Clara Bell, no cry for help, no movement in the brush, nothing but the damp quiet of a Tuesday in a small town, interrupted only by the low murmur of radios and the sound of rain against the fence. And with every passing minute, the gap between when she was last seen and now became harder to bridge, leaving the first responders with a chilling truth. Whatever happened to Clara had taken place in less than the time it took to turn away. Within 30 minutes of the 911 call, the quiet street outside Bright Steps Daycare had transformed into the center of a coordinated emergency response. Patrol cars blocked both ends of the block, yellow tape stretched across the playground gates, and a growing cluster of uniformed officers moved with sharp purpose. Detectives from the Milford Police Department arrived alongside the county's specialized missing persons unit, each step calculated to secure every inch of potential evidence before it slipped away. The playground was the first priority. Officers asked staff to retrace their movements from the moment Clara was last seen. The blue playhouse, now standing empty in the drizzle, became the focal point. Detectives crouched to examine the wet grass where the plush rabbit had been found, photographing it from multiple angles before sealing it in an evidence bag. Search dogs were unloaded from a K9 unit van and fitted with harnesses, their handlers exchanging quick, quiet words with investigators. One dog was given Clara's scent from the rabbit. Within seconds, it lowered its head and began pulling toward the hedge that lined the back of the yard. The hedge was dense, overgrown, and backed onto a narrow strip of land that separated the daycare fence from a municipal service road. From the playground, that road wasn't visible, a natural blind spot created by years of unchecked growth. The dog's handler called out as the animal located a break in the hedge, a shoulder-width gap where the branches had been pushed aside. The damp soil beneath was compressed, the impressions faint but visible to a trained eye. The scent trail led straight through. Beyond the hedge, the service road was little more than a single lane of cracked asphalt, used occasionally by utility trucks. Officers followed the dog along it, but less than 30 yards from the gap, the trail faded abruptly. Handlers said the loss of scent was likely due to both the rain and the possibility that Clara had been lifted off the ground, something that often happened in abduction cases to prevent a child from leaving a trail. While the search dogs continued to work the perimeter, another team canvassed nearby homes and businesses. Detectives collected any available security footage, focusing on the hours between 9 a.m. and 11 a.m. A convenience store 2 blocks away offered camera access, but the footage yielded no sight of a child matching Clara's description. The next logical step was traffic camera data. A camera positioned 1 block over on Milford Avenue was checked frame by frame. It showed ordinary weekday traffic, a few sedans, a delivery truck, a cyclist, but no toddler in a yellow coat, no one carrying a child, and no vehicle lingering suspiciously near the service road entrance. Inside the daycare, parents who had been there that morning were gathered in the main room. Detectives moved between them, taking individual statements, asking for exact arrival and departure times, descriptions of anything unusual they might have seen or heard. Some remembered the drizzle, others recalled the smell of wet leaves coming through an open door, but none could point to a moment that explained Clara's disappearance. The staff were questioned one by one, each separated from the others to avoid shared influence. One teacher admitted she hadn't been able to see the playhouse door clearly from her post near the swings. Another said she heard a metallic click around the time Clara vanished but couldn't identify the source. As the afternoon wore on, the rain grew steadier. Detectives knew the clock was working against them. Water would quickly erase any footprints, scent traces, or subtle ground disturbances that might point toward a direction of travel. Additional K9 units arrived, along with officers from neighboring towns, their patrol cars lining the streets in both directions. By late afternoon, the search expanded. Flyers with Clara's photo were printed on site and distributed to every officer, volunteer, and business owner in the area. Utility workers were asked to check manhole covers, storm drains, and construction sites. Search teams, organized into grid patterns, began combing through nearby woods and empty lots, the sound of boots squelching in mud, the sweep of flashlights into culverts, and the low murmur of radios filled the gray air. Word of the disappearance spread quickly. By early evening, hundreds of residents from Milford and the surrounding communities had arrived to help. They brought rain jackets, headlamps, and thermoses of coffee, their faces tight with concern. Search coordinators marked off sectors on a large laminated map, assigning volunteers to check under porches, behind sheds, and along creek beds. The local fire department deployed a thermal imaging drone, scanning for heat signatures in thick vegetation. It picked up small animals, the outlines of parked cars, but no child. Clara's parents remained on site, speaking briefly to reporters before retreating into the daycare's side office with detectives. Witness descriptions were compared again, timelines refined down to the minute, every gap scrutinized. Outside, the rain washed down the gutters, pooling in the dips of the asphalt, blurring chalk markings left by officers earlier in the day. By nightfall, floodlights were set up in the playground and along the service road, turning the mist into a glowing haze. The search was still active, but the mood had shifted. Hours had passed with no confirmed sighting, no item of clothing, no cry for help in the distance. For the officers, each passing hour without a lead meant the possibility of recovery grew slimmer. For the community, it was the dawning realization that Clara Bell might have vanished from the center of their town in broad daylight, and that the answer to how and why could already be slipping beyond their reach. In the days after Clara Bell's disappearance, the investigation shifted from frantic searching to the painstaking process of reconstructing every second of the morning she vanished. Detectives began by sitting each staff member down in separate rooms, asking them to walk through the day in their own words. Timelines were drawn on large whiteboards, names and times filling the space in neat color-coded lines. Every minute was accounted for, except the one that mattered most. The accounts all overlapped in familiar places. Clara arrived at 8:17 a.m., wore a yellow raincoat, carried her rabbit, and spent most of the morning in the toddler play area. At 10:41 a.m., she was seen near the playhouse door. Then, nothing. That was the gap, the vanishing gap, between her last confirmed sighting and the moment her absence was noticed. One detail, however, stood out. A teacher assigned to the swing set recalled hearing a metallic click just before Clara disappeared. She described it as sharp but muffled, like the sound of a latch or hinge snapping into place. She couldn't say which direction it came from. The drizzle and the noise of children playing blurred the source. At the time, she thought it might have been part of the playhouse door hardware, but the thought unsettled her now. Crime scene technicians returned to the hedge gap behind the playhouse, working methodically despite the ground being wetter than on the day of the disappearance. They photographed the space, measuring the width of the opening in the branches. In the soil beneath, they found faint impressions, elongated, patterned, and spaced in a way that didn't match the erratic steps of a child. These marks were too deep and too narrow to belong to toddler shoes, yet not as deep as they might have been if made by someone running. The tread pattern, partially preserved in the wet earth, suggested work boots. The impression closest to the playground side was angled slightly, as if the person wearing them had stepped in, then pivoted. On the other side of the hedge, the ground was disturbed in a similar way, but the rain had softened the edges beyond precise measurement. The text noted the findings, adding them to the growing body of evidence that Clara hadn't simply wandered away. Across the street from the daycare, investigators knocked on the door of a small single-story home with a clear view of the service road entrance. The homeowner, an older woman who had been in her living room that morning, said she had noticed a white van idling across from the hedge break. It had been there for several minutes before she turned away to answer the phone. She couldn't remember seeing anyone get in or out. There were no markings or logos on the van, nothing to indicate a company or service. When pressed, she admitted she hadn't looked at the license plate and couldn't recall any distinctive dents or stickers. Detectives canvassed the surrounding streets for other sightings of the same vehicle. A delivery driver in the next block reported seeing a similar white van that morning but thought little of it. Utility and delivery vehicles were common in the area. The lack of distinguishing details meant the tip, while valuable, was frustratingly vague. Inside the command post set up in a mobile operations trailer, investigators overlaid the staff's recollections with witness statements from neighbors. Clara's last sighting at the playhouse was marked with a red pin. The click heard by the teacher was placed seconds later. The hedge gap and the possible position of the van were connected by a thin black line. It formed a short, direct route, one that could have been crossed in less than half a minute. Day 2 ended with no new sightings and no physical evidence beyond the boot impressions. That night, the FBI's Child Abduction Rapid Deployment Team arrived, reviewing every recorded detail. Their early assessment was blunt. While no one had witnessed a handoff or physical contact, the circumstances suggested intervention by an adult. The timing, the location of the hedge gap, the van's presence, these elements aligned too neatly to be ignored. By the morning of Day 3, the tone of the investigation had shifted. The search grids in the woods and neighborhoods continued, but the case was no longer treated as a lost child scenario. Officially, it was reclassified as a suspected abduction. The command post briefing began with a stark statement from the lead detective. "We are no longer looking for a child who walked away. We are looking for a child who was taken." For Clara's parents, the change brought a hollow kind of clarity. It explained the speed, the silence, the absence of tracks beyond the hedge, but it also deepened the dread. A missing child could be found wandering. An abducted child was at the mercy of someone else, someone who had planned enough to act in broad daylight, in a space filled with people, and vanish without a trace. In the tight-knit town of Milford, rumors began to spread faster than facts. Some said the van had been seen in the area days before. Others claimed the hedge gap was a known shortcut used by teenagers. Police addressed each lead, but none proved conclusive. The timeline remained fixed, a matter of minutes in which Clara had gone from a visible, laughing toddler to a name on a missing persons bulletin, and in those minutes, someone else's footsteps had left the only trace behind. Detectives began widening their search beyond Milford, knowing that isolated abduction cases often gained clarity when viewed in a larger pattern. They pulled incident reports from every jurisdiction within a 100-mile radius over the past decade, filtering for cases involving children under the age of 5 who disappeared from public spaces. Most files were quickly ruled out: custody disputes, confirmed runaways with older siblings, and cases resolved within hours. But 2 stood out. The first was from 7 years earlier, in a park just outside of Hamilton. A 3-year-old boy, Matthew Collier, had been playing near a sandpit while his mother sat on a bench reading. She looked up to find him gone. Witnesses recalled seeing the boy moments earlier, but no one saw him leave. There was no sign of a struggle, no unfamiliar vehicle recorded entering or leaving the park during the critical window. The only thing left behind was his pacifier, found on the edge of the sandbox. It was resting upright, clean, as though placed there intentionally. Matthew was never found. The second case dated back 4 years, in a shopping center courtyard in Brantford. 2-year-old Olivia Parker had been holding her father's hand while they watched a street musician perform. He said she let go for only a second to step toward the edge of the crowd. In that moment, she vanished. Security footage showed her walking into a blind spot between 2 kiosks, but she never re-emerged on camera. The search area was flooded with officers within minutes, but no physical trace was discovered, except for one of her sneakers lying just inside the service corridor behind the kiosks. The laces were neatly tied. Olivia was also never found. Both cases carried haunting similarities to Clara's: a sudden disappearance in a populated area, a short time frame, no confirmed sighting of an abductor, and a single, seemingly deliberate item left behind. In Clara's case, it had been her rabbit. Detectives noted that in all 3 cases, the objects were not lost mid-struggle or dropped in panic. They appeared positioned in a way that drew attention to them. The FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit sent 2 profilers to join the investigation. After reviewing the files side by side, they floated a theory. The perpetrator might intentionally leave behind a personal object to both mark the abduction site and create the illusion of a chance disappearance. By controlling the point of access, whether it was a hedge gap, a service corridor, or an open play area, the offender could execute the abduction swiftly and retreat along a planned escape route, out of sight before anyone registered the child was gone. The placement of the item, they suggested, served two purposes: to misdirect initial searches and to psychologically imprint the loss on anyone connected to the victim. While these theories circulated within the command post, detectives also had to rule out the most painful possibility, that someone within Clara's own family was involved. Her parents, exhausted and hollow-eyed, agreed to take polygraph tests without hesitation. Both passed, their answers steady when recounting the morning's events and their movements in the hours that followed. Investigators dug into their financial records, phone logs, and digital activity. Nothing indicated any connection to the earlier cases or to anyone who might have targeted Clara. Clearing the family publicly was complicated. While the police were careful not to cast suspicion without evidence, the absence of a named suspect meant that rumors continued to spread. In a small town like Milford, gossip moved quickly. Some claimed to have seen unfamiliar vehicles. In the days before the abduction, others whispered about tensions among daycare staff. Detectives chased each lead, but most collapsed under scrutiny. Meanwhile, the media presence intensified. National news outlets picked up the story after learning of the possible links to the earlier unsolved cases. Satellite vans parked along the curb outside the daycare, their antennas jutting into the gray sky. Reporters leaned over metal barricades to call questions toward anyone leaving the building. The constant presence of cameras turned bright steps into a spectacle, a backdrop for headlines about the Toddler triangle, a phrase coined by one tabloid to describe the three cases. Parents bringing their children to and from the daycare now walked quickly, heads down, avoiding the microphones pushed toward them. Staff members, still shaken, found themselves answering the same questions from both detectives and journalists, repeating the few details they had until the words felt meaningless. Inside, the children played, too young to understand why their routines were changing, why certain doors stayed locked, and why they were no longer allowed outside without two adults present. For Clara's parents, the days were a blur of interviews, press conferences, and sleepless nights. They sat in the front row at every briefing, waiting for any scrap of news that might break the standoff between unanswered questions and vanishing time. The idea that someone had done this before, twice, was both a source of hope and despair. Hope, because maybe a pattern could be traced. Despair, because in both earlier cases there had been no resolution. By the end of the first week, the evidence board in the command trailer bore 3 columns: Matthew, Olivia, and Clara, each lined with photographs, maps, and bullet points. Between them ran red strings marking shared elements: fast vanish times, minimal witnesses, single personal items left behind. The image was stark and damning. Whatever had happened in Milford, it was not an isolated act. And if the same person or group was responsible, then they had been moving undetected for years, crossing towns, blending into public spaces, and leaving behind only the smallest, most deliberate traces of their crimes. The plush rabbit had been sealed in an evidence bag since the first hours of the investigation, cataloged and stored in the property room while other leads took priority. It was, after all, the only physical object recovered from the moment Clara vanished. Now, weeks later, with the case stalled and every promising tip exhausted, the forensics team decided to take another, deeper look at it. This time, they would treat it not just as a sentimental item, but as a possible carrier of trace evidence. In the lab, the rabbit was placed on a clean stainless steel table under controlled lighting. Every seam, every fiber was photographed in high resolution. Then, using UV light, the technicians began scanning its surface for anything that didn't belong. Most of what they saw at first was predictable: lint, faint soil stains, and residue from repeated washing. But when the light passed over the seam under its left arm, something caught their attention: minuscule threads embedded in the stitching. They were pale blue, almost translucent, and distinctly synthetic in texture. Under magnification, the fibers had a uniform weave not used in the toy's manufacturing. They were unlike cotton or wool, instead resembling something durable and industrial. The lab submitted the sample for material analysis, running it through a database of known fiber types. The results came back with a match. The fibers were consistent with industrial-grade microfiber cleaning cloths, the type frequently used in auto repair shops, detailing businesses, and mechanical workshops. It was the first new, tangible lead in days. Detectives immediately considered the implications. If the fibers had transferred to Clara's rabbit, it could mean the toy had been placed on, near, or wiped with such a cloth after she vanished. It was possible the contact had occurred at the abduction site, or later, wherever she'd been taken. The information was pushed out to local precincts and to the public in a targeted way, focusing on potential witnesses without revealing every detail. Detectives began visiting auto garages, both operational and recently closed, within a 10-mile radius. They carried photographs of the fibers, asking mechanics if they recognized the type or brand. Most nodded in vague recognition. Microfiber cloths were common in their line of work. But one shop owner in the industrial section of Milford mentioned something more specific. He remembered that a similar blue cloth was once supplied to a garage about 2 miles from the Daycare, a small family-run operation that had shut down 3 years earlier after the owner's death. The garage, known locally as Brandt's Auto Service, had been left largely untouched since it closed. Its front windows were coated in dust, and a faded "For Lease" sign hung crookedly in one corner. The property records showed no recent tenants and no active business license. Armed with a warrant, detectives approached the building late in the afternoon. The front door's lock was broken, not smashed but worn, as though it had been opened and closed repeatedly without repair. Inside, the air was heavy with the unmistakable scent of industrial disinfectant, sharp and chemical. It was a smell that clung to the walls and floor, suggesting it had been used recently, not years ago. The main garage bay was empty except for a scattering of debris, a bent tire iron, an overturned stool, and a stack of plastic buckets in the corner. The concrete floor showed faint streaks where something had been dragged or mopped. Detectives moved cautiously through the space, documenting everything. In the far corner, near a workbench, coated in dust, was a section of a wall that seemed oddly clean compared to the rest. On it, in faint chalky lines, were drawings, crude but recognizable as flowers. Some were simple stick outlines, others filled in with uneven shading. They were low to the ground, at a height where a child might have drawn them. The chalk itself was old, pale yellow and white, its pieces resting in a shallow plastic cup on the floor. For a moment, no one spoke. The sight of the flowers, innocent in any other context, took on a heavier weight here. The wall was photographed in detail, each drawing captured from multiple angles. Technicians collected the chalk and dust samples from the baseboard. There were no obvious fingerprints, and the floor beneath the wall had been wiped clean. A storage room at the back of the garage contained little more than a broken chair, a pile of flattened cardboard boxes, and an empty metal shelf. Yet even here, the smell of disinfectant lingered. It was strongest near the drain in the center of the concrete floor, where traces of moisture remained despite no visible leaks in the room. A swab was taken for chemical analysis. No direct evidence of Clara was found. No clothing, no hair, no personal items beyond the chalk drawings. But the garage was clearly not as abandoned as it appeared. Someone had been inside recently, someone who cleaned thoroughly, who left almost nothing behind but an odor, a set of faint markings, and the possibility that a child had once stood in that corner with chalk in hand. When the search team emerged into the fading light outside, the street was quiet, lined with warehouses and shuttered businesses. It wasn't hard to imagine how a white van could have parked here unnoticed, and though the garage yielded no proof of where Clara was now, it raised a chilling question. Had she been here, in this silent space, sometime after the morning she vanished? And if so, had the rabbit carried away the only trace? The weeks that followed the garage search were marked less by breakthroughs and more by an accumulating heavy stillness. Leads came in almost daily at first, some through official tip lines, others from well-meaning locals convinced they had seen something important. but each was run down and, in time, dismissed. The initial urgency of the investigation, that tight coil of momentum from the first days, began to loosen. The FBI's sketch artist worked closely with the neighbor who had glimpsed the white van idling near the daycare. Hours were spent in a quiet room going over facial features, the curve of a jawline, the set of the eyes, the shape of the hair under a cap. What emerged was a composite drawing of a man in his late 30s to early 40s, average build, no immediately distinctive scars or tattoos. It was distributed to law enforcement agencies across the state, flashed across the evening news, and shared tens of thousands of times on social media. But the E-doll face stirred no recognition that led anywhere useful. Tips naming possible matches arrived by the dozen, and each was checked. Most led to men with solid alibis. A few couldn't be located at first but were later ruled out. At the same time, the search areas beyond the town began to work against the investigation. Seasonal storms swept through Milford and the surrounding counties, flooding low-lying areas and washing out wooded trails that had been meticulously gridded in the first week. The service road behind the daycare became a narrow stream during heavy rains, the soil along the hedge gap turning to thick mud that swallowed any remaining trace of the impressions found there. Search dogs brought back for follow-up sweeps found nothing to track. It was as though the environment itself was erasing the morning of September 24th, piece by piece. In early November, a call came in from a nearby town. Staff at another daycare had reported a man lingering in a parking lot for over an hour, watching children on the playground from his car. The description was vague, but enough to send a team of local officers to detain him. He was brought in for questioning, and his vehicle was impounded for forensic examination. For a brief moment, it felt like the first real movement in weeks. The man's answers were evasive, his timeline inconsistent. But within days, DNA results came back. His profile did not match any samples taken from Clara's rabbit or the garage. Further checks revealed he'd been in the area for unrelated work, and though his behavior was unsettling, there was no evidence linking him to Clara or the white van. He was released without charges. By then, the Bell family had taken their search far beyond Milford. They appeared on national morning shows, their faces pale but determined, speaking directly into cameras and addressing whoever might know where their daughter was. They sat on panel discussions for crime-focused segments, telling and retelling the events of that morning, holding up photos of Clara, some smiling, some candid, all painfully frozen in time. Each appearance brought in a wave of new calls to the tip line, but most of those tips echoed old ones, circling back to the same unconfirmed sightings or vague suspicions already investigated. Local volunteers, still committed despite the fading momentum, continued their own outreach. They printed thousands of updated flyers, featuring both Clara's photo and the composite sketch of the van driver, posting them on storefront windows, bulletin boards, and gas pumps. Some traveled to neighboring towns to hang them along rural highways and at truck stops, hoping that someone, somewhere, might recognize a detail the police had missed. But in the second month, the calls began to slow. By the third, the tip line was quiet for days at a time. Inside the command trailer, the evidence boards remained pinned with the same photographs, maps, and red string connections that had been there for weeks. Investigators still checked in daily, reviewing any incoming information, but the tone of their conversations shifted. They spoke more about if than when. Detectives who had once spent every waking hour on the case began to be reassigned to other duties, their work on Clara's disappearance reduced to follow-ups on the occasional lead. By December, with no credible new evidence and no verified sightings, the official designation of the case changed. The words landed with a cold finality. Inactive, pending new evidence. It didn't mean the search was over, but it meant the machinery of the investigation would no longer move at the pace it had in those first desperate weeks. For Clara's parents, the phrase felt like a door quietly closing. Outside, the flyers weathered in the wind and rain, their corners curling, the colors fading. In some places, they were torn down to make room for new notices. On the local news, Coverage shifted to other stories, Clara's name mentioned only when an anniversary or related event brought it back into focus. The white van, the hedge gap, the rabbit, all still unanswered but receding from the collective urgency of the town. In the Bell household, the yellow raincoat still hung in the front closet, its fabric carrying the faint scent of the fabric softener her mother had always used. And while the case file might now be marked inactive, for her family, every day still began and ended with the same thought. Somewhere out there, the truth existed. It was just no longer moving toward them. By the fall of 2029, Bright Steps Daycare bore little resemblance to the place it had been the morning Clara Bell vanished. The paint was fresh, the playground equipment newer, and the old blue playhouse was gone, dismantled 2 years earlier during a renovation. The hedge gap behind the yard had been sealed with a tall wooden fence, its boards weathered but unbroken. The daycare was under new ownership, the original staff long since scattered to other jobs, but Clara's name still lived in quiet corners of conversation. For the parents who had been here in 2025, the story wasn't just history. It was a caution they passed to newcomers. When touring the playground, someone inevitably pointed toward the back fence and murmured about the hedge gap, watching the new faces register the weight of it. Each September 24th, a small vigil was held at dusk. Parents, former staff, and a few of the detectives who had worked the case gathered near the sandbox with candles in hand. Some brought yellow flowers, others left toys at the base of the fence. Clara's parents attended when they could, standing apart from the cluster of people but always facing the spot where the playhouse used to stand. The vigils were quiet affairs. No speeches, no news cameras anymore, but the air was always heavy, as though the space itself remembered. That autumn, a new hire named Erica joined the daycare's closing shift. She was young, still getting used to the routines, wiping down tables, stacking chairs, gathering toys left scattered in the corners. It was during one of those first weeks that she noticed something strange. In the toddler room, there was a low shelf lined with brightly colored battery-operated toy instruments, a small keyboard, a plastic drum set, a toy guitar. They were usually switched off after the children left for the day. But on several evenings as she made her last rounds before locking up, Erica heard music drifting faintly from the closed room. It was always the same melody, soft, slow, and oddly gentle for toys designed to play tinny, upbeat tunes. She couldn't place it at first. The sound stopped the moment she opened the door, leaving only the faint hum of the overhead lights. The instruments sat exactly where they had been left, their power switches in the off position. She mentioned it casually to a coworker, who shrugged and said the wiring in the building was finicky. Sometimes battery toys would short and play on their own, especially in older structures. Still, Erica began listening for it. Some nights, it didn't happen at all. Other nights, it would start just as she was locking the front door, a slow, looping lullaby that seemed to come from more than one instrument at once. Once, she tried to sneak up quietly, hoping to catch them in the act, but the moment her hand touched the doorknob, the sound cut off. When she stepped inside, the room was still, the toys inert. After a week of this, she told the center's director. The explanation was the same. Faulty wiring, maybe residual charge in the circuits. The toys were inexpensive, mass-produced. Things like that happened. Erica nodded, but the answer didn't sit comfortably. It wasn't just that they played without being touched. It was that they played the same song every time. And no matter how many times she entered mid-melody, she could never catch them still playing. The timing bothered her too. The sounds only ever started after the building had gone quiet, after the last child had left and the last staff member besides herself was gone. She started making a habit of turning the instruments so their speakers faced the wall when she cleaned, just to break whatever strange rhythm they seemed to have found. But even then, she swore she could hear it faintly from the hallway, a lullaby so soft it was almost like humming. When she finally mentioned the melody to one of the older staff members, a woman who had been working in Milford long before joining Bright Steps, the reaction was different. The woman stopped what she was doing, a stack of mats in her arms, and stared at her for a moment. Then she asked quietly, "What song?" Erica hummed the first few notes as best she could. The woman's face shifted, recognition followed by something heavier. She didn't explain, only said, "It's probably nothing," and went back to stacking mats. Later, Erica would learn from another staffer about the girl who had gone missing years earlier, about the rabbit found in the playground, about how, according to her mother, there had been one song she sang to her daughter every night before bed. No one officially connected the two things. The director still insisted it was a quirk of the toys, maybe even interference from nearby electronics. But in the staff room, the talk was quieter. People avoided being alone in the toddler room after closing. And while the new fence had erased the physical reminder of the hedge gap, something else now lingered in the air after dark, something that didn't stop until the last key turned in the lock. Word of the strange closing time music began to slip beyond staff whispers. Parents who picked up late sometimes caught a faint trace of the melody drifting from the toddler room and asked about it in passing. Most accepted the explanation about quirky old toys, but not everyone was convinced. One father, a software technician with a habit of troubleshooting problems until he found their source, decided to test it for himself. On a Thursday evening in late October, after the last child was collected and the staff were preparing to lock up, he quietly asked the director if he could leave a small recording device overnight. He claimed it was just curiosity, but there was an undercurrent of something more, the need to know if the stories were exaggerated or if something truly odd was happening. The director agreed, though reluctantly, and the man set his phone on a low shelf in the toddler room, tucked between a stack of storybooks and a bin of plastic blocks. He started an audio recording app with a motion-activated feature and left it running. The room was empty, the toys silent. The door was locked behind him. When he returned the next morning to collect the device, he said nothing to the staff, only thanked them and left. That evening, after his children were in bed, he sat at his kitchen table and began scrubbing through the recording. For hours, there was nothing but the faint hum of the building's ventilation and the occasional creak of the settling structure. Then, just after 8 p.m., the app registered movement and the waveform on the screen shifted. The sound began softly, almost tentative, a series of slow, deliberate notes in a sequence that was immediately recognizable, but somehow wrong. It was, "Hush, little baby," but drawn out and off-tempo, each note lingering too long before the next began. The timbre was strange, not the tinny jingle of battery-powered toy speakers, but something muted, as if played through a layer of cloth or from inside a box. Beneath it, barely audible at first, was a sound that made the father pause the playback and lean closer to the laptop speakers. It was humming. The humming matched the pitch of the lullaby almost perfectly, following its rise and fall as though whoever or whatever made the sound knew the song well. At one point, the humming swelled slightly, overtaking the toy's melody for 2 beats before fading back under it. The music stopped abruptly after one full run-through, replaced again by the quiet hum of the building systems. The father shared the file with a friend who worked in audio engineering, asking if there was a plausible technical explanation. His friend ran the clip through spectrogram analysis, isolating the toy's tones from the underlying hum. The results were unsettling. The upper frequency range didn't match the stock sound bank of any toy instrument currently sold in the United States. The pitch bending and tempo irregularities weren't consistent with low battery distortion or interference, and the humming, when isolated, had formant patterns consistent with a human voice, an adult's, not a child's. Armed with the analysis, the father went to the police. Detectives visited the daycare the next day, collected the toy keyboard, drum set, and guitar from the toddler room, and sent them to a state forensics lab. The toys were dismantled, their circuits tested for damage, corrosion, or signs of modification. Each was confirmed to be functioning normally. Their built-in melodies were compared to the recording, and none matched. Under controlled conditions, none could be made to reproduce the distorted lullaby. When the results came back inconclusive, the police returned the toys to the daycare. But before doing so, they asked Clara's mother to listen to the recording privately. She sat in a small interview room at the station, the file playing through a pair of padded headphones. At the first few notes, she froze. Her eyes stayed fixed on the table, but her breathing changed. She listened through the full loop, silent except for a sharp inhale when the humming swelled. When it ended, she took off the headphones slowly. "That's mine," she said. The detectives asked what she meant. She explained that the song, not just the lyrics, but the pacing, the inflection, even the subtle pauses, matched the way she had sung "Hush, Little Baby" to Clara every night from the time she was born until the week she disappeared. She had never recorded herself singing it, never shared it online. "I always slowed it down," she added, "so she'd know it was bedtime. That's what she'd hear before she fell asleep." Her certainty left the room quiet. The detectives didn't dispute her recognition, but neither could they explain it. The toys, by all available evidence, should not have been able to play that version of the song. And yet, in the recording, there it was, along with the low hum of a voice that seemed to know every note. The file was added to the case archive. Publicly, the police made no comment about the recording or its contents. Privately, some investigators dismissed it as an unexplained anomaly, perhaps an elaborate prank. Others kept returning to the same unspoken question. If the sound wasn't coming from the toys, where was it coming from? And why, after 4 years of silence, was Clara's lullaby playing in the place where she'd last been seen? It had been more than 4 years since anyone had conducted a full, methodical search of the Bright Steps building. After the recording of the lullaby surfaced, detectives requested access for a comprehensive walkthrough, every room, every closet, every locked space. The current management cooperated, though some staff admitted quietly that they were uneasy about what might be found. The search began at the front, moving slowly through classrooms, offices, and play areas. Each space was photographed and documented, even if it looked completely ordinary. Detectives examined vents, ceiling tiles, storage bins, and wall panels, working their way toward the rear of the building. The toddler area, the same section where the toys had played the strange melody, was given special attention. That was when one officer noticed something peculiar on the floor plan. A small rectangular space marked storage that had no visible entrance from the hallway. The door was there, hidden behind a tall bookshelf stacked with labeled tubs of art supplies. The director explained that it was a storage room seldom used. She had never been inside herself. When the shelf was moved aside, a plain beige door came into view, fitted with a newer lock that didn't match the other hardware in the building. It looked clean, the brass still bright, without the tarnish of age. When asked who had the key, the director frowned and went to check the key box in the office. None of the labeled keys matched. With her permission, detectives called for a locksmith to open the door. The lock gave after several minutes, the mechanism clicking softly before swinging open into a space thick with stale air. Inside, the room was small, windowless, and lined with metal shelving. Dust coated nearly every surface, undisturbed for what looked like years. Cardboard boxes filled the shelves, some collapsing under their own weight. Most were labeled with dates and vague descriptions: Toys 2017, books, holiday decorations. A layer of grit covered the concrete floor, broken only by the faint lines of something having been dragged across it long ago. Detectives began opening the boxes one by one. Most contained exactly what the labels promised: mismatched toy parts, old plastic building blocks, worn puzzles missing pieces. But halfway through the second shelf, they came to a box labeled simply MISC. Inside, beneath a tangle of small plastic cars and a deflated kickball, was a single folded piece of pale blue cloth. The sight of it immediately tightened the air in the room. Even before testing, the forensics officer present recognized the texture, the same weave and synthetic sheen as the fibers recovered from Clara's rabbit years earlier. It was soft but sturdy, the kind of industrial-grade microfiber used for heavy cleaning in garages or workshops. The cloth was sealed in an evidence bag and labeled on the spot. The discovery prompted a closer look at the room itself. There were no signs of forced entry, no splintered wood, no damaged hinges. But the locksmith confirmed what detectives suspected. The lock on the door was relatively new, likely replaced within the past year. Whoever had changed it had done so deliberately, with no record of the modification in the building's maintenance logs. From there, investigators turned their attention to staffing records. They requested a list of every employee who had worked in maintenance, janitorial, or custodial roles in the past 5 years. Cross-referencing resignation dates with the estimated time the lock was replaced, they found one name that stood out: a night janitor who had quit abruptly 6 months earlier. His departure had been unexplained, noted only as personal reasons. When police attempted to contact him, they found no forwarding address. The phone number on file was disconnected. His listed emergency contact was a cousin who claimed they hadn't spoken in years and had no idea where he was living. Background checks revealed a patchy employment history, multiple short-term custodial jobs in small towns across the state, leaving each within a year or less. None of his past employers reported any formal complaints, but several mentioned he had a habit of keeping to himself and working when no one else was in the building. Detectives added his name to the case file, but with no current address or active phone, tracking him would require a wider search. The timing of his departure, the replaced lock, and the cloth found in the room were enough to move him into the category of person of interest. But without direct evidence tying him to Clara's disappearance, it was not enough for a warrant. Back at the daycare, the storage room was sealed as a potential crime scene. The current staff avoided discussing it openly, but the unease spread. Parents who heard fragments of the discovery through gossip began asking pointed questions about security and background checks. The director held a brief meeting to assure them that the police were handling the matter, but she didn't mention the pale blue cloth or its connection to the original investigation. In the official report, the find was listed as Item 43, a simple microfiber cleaning rag. But for those who had worked Clara's case from the beginning, it wasn't just another piece of cloth. It was the same texture, the same weave, and almost the same shade as the fibers that had been caught in the stitching of the rabbit found on the wet grass 4 years earlier. The only difference now was that it was whole, folded neatly, as if someone had meant to return for it. Detectives, working the cold trail of the former janitor, finally traced his last known address to a narrow, aging duplex on the outskirts of a neighboring county. The mailbox still bore his name in faded black letters, but the unit itself was empty. Inside, the landlord explained, the place had been vacant for months. The man had left without notice, abandoning the last weeks of his lease and taking all of his belongings. There had been no forwarding address, no request to transfer utilities. Neighbors remembered him only vaguely, a quiet figure who kept his curtains drawn even during the day. He rarely spoke, never invited anyone over, and seemed to have no visitors. Several recalled seeing him leave late at night in an unmarked white van, its paint dull and unpolished, the kind that could blend into a parking lot without drawing a second glance. One neighbor said the van sometimes returned just before dawn, its headlights off until the last moment before pulling into the driveway. No one could say where he went. When asked if they had ever heard anything unusual, one woman hesitated. She remembered faint music once or twice in the early hours, a slow, childlike tune drifting from somewhere, though she couldn't be sure if it came from his unit or another. She'd chalked it up to a television left on or a music box. Detectives noted the detail, but could do little with it. Without a forwarding lead, the man had simply evaporated. The search of the property yielded nothing tangible. The apartment was bare except for dust and a few stray screws on the floor where shelving had once been. The garage was empty, the smell of oil faint but old, the floor stained in places by something long cleaned but never fully gone. There was no sign of the van. Every possible paper trail, bank accounts, credit records, employment applications, seemed to go dark after his departure. With nowhere else to take that lead, the investigation once again slowed. The toys taken for forensic testing were eventually returned to Bright Steps. They were placed back on the same low shelf in the toddler room, lined up in neat rows, the small keyboard, the plastic drum set, the toy guitar. For the first few days after their return, nothing happened. The room stayed silent after hours, and some staff began to hope that the strange occurrences had ended with their removal. But on the 5th evening, just after the building's last light was switched off, the lullaby returned. It began, as it always had, soft, slowed, and faint. The first notes of "Hush, Little Baby" drifting into the hallway. This time, though, it didn't stop after one loop. The melody played again and again, as if caught in a deliberate cycle. Staff on closing shift reported hearing it continue for nearly 15 minutes before cutting out suddenly. The next night, the song started again, but there was something new beneath it. Between the notes, almost perfectly in time with the melody, came a faint, tapping sound. At first it was hard to place, but the rhythm soon became unmistakable. Light, uneven taps like small fingers pressing down on plastic keys. Some nights the taps were slow and deliberate. Other nights they came in quick bursts, as if keeping up with the pace of the song. By the third night, several staff members refused to be in the toddler room alone after closing. One said she stood outside the door and could hear the tapping change as though responding to her presence. When she opened the door, the sound stopped instantly, the toys as still as if they had never been touched. Word of the resumed music spread quickly, though the daycare's management avoided discussing it openly with parents. Still, whispers made their way into the community, that the lullaby was back, that it had grown longer, stranger. A few parents quietly asked to move their children to classrooms farther from the toddler room. Some even began picking up earlier to avoid the last hour of the day. For Clara's family, the news cut in two directions. The idea that her lullaby, the same slowed, gentle version her mother had sung to her, was still playing inside the building was a fresh wound. But it was also, in a way they could not entirely explain, proof that something of her was still present. Someone or something still knew that song. Whether it was a taunt, a message, or a trace of her own memory, they could not say. The official stance from police remained unchanged. The case was still classified as unsolved, inactive, until credible new evidence emerged. The recording of the lullaby was in the file, the pale blue cloth bagged and stored in evidence, the former janitor's name still listed as a person of interest. But without his location, without a clear connection that could stand in court, the investigation had reached another standstill. In Milford, Bright Steps' closing time became an unspoken boundary. Parents, staff, even the cleaning crew seemed to find reasons to be gone before the last light was turned off. The sound of a lullaby, meant to comfort, now carried an edge that lingered long after it faded. And in that small toddler room, where shelves held toys no one trusted anymore, the music sometimes played on in the dark, accompanied by the faint deliberate tapping of hands no one could see.